The Chrysler 300 was named for the 300 horsepower that it had for exactly one model year. The original Chrysler 300 of 1955 used the same body as other Chrysler models, including the same 126-inch wheelbase, but the front-end styling came from the bigger Imperial models. The car was aimed specifically at NASCAR and was not even included in most of Chrysler's marketing. The 331 cubic inch firepower V8 with its hemispherical combustion chamber heads, dual 4-barrel carbs, performance cam, and dual exhaust was rated at 300 horsepower, giving the car its name, making it the first regular production car to reach the 300 horsepower mark. Regular production meant 1,725 examples of this hardtop coupe were produced in 1955, with prices starting at just over $4,100. Stiffer suspension was also part of the package, and trim was reduced compared to other Chrysler models, and it was only available in black, white, and red. The car did a flying mile at 127 miles an hour and was advertised as the world's fastest stock car. For 1956, the car became the 300B, and like other Chryslers, saw the addition of integrated tail fins, and new options included a 617 rear differential, as well as a highway hi-fi record player. The engine was upgraded to 354 cubic inches and was available in either 340 or 355 horsepower configurations, making it the first American car with 1 horsepower per cubic inch and raising the top speed to 140 miles an hour. Prices now started above $4,400 and only 1,102 were made. The 300C of 1957 was slightly less focused on NASCAR, with more aggressive styling, and now included a convertible. The Hemi V8 was up to 392 cubic inches, offered in 375 and 390 horsepower versions. Prices were now above $4,900 for the coupe, $5,400 if you opted for air conditioning. Just over 2,400 were made. For 1958, 300D production was just over 800, and the 392 V8 produced 380 horsepower, except for a very small number of electro-ejector transistor-controlled fuel-injected versions that produced 390 horsepower, although most of those cars would be converted to the standard dual carb setup, which was good enough for speeds over 155 miles an hour and a 0 to 60 time of about 6.5 seconds. For the 1959 300E, the Hemi was replaced by a 413 wedge, but otherwise there was only slight trim changes. Power remained the same at 380, but the bigger, lighter engine produced 15 more pound-feet of torque at 450. Production was just under 650 and prices above $5,300. 1960 saw the 300F switch to unibody construction, with revised styling that included the first crosshair grille that would become the 300's trademark look. The big V8 dropped to 375 horsepower in standard trim. The cars had 4 bucket seats and Astrodome electroluminescent instrumentation. Just over 1,200 were produced, including a few 400 horsepower competition models with various upgrades that in some cases included a Facel Vega 4-speed manual. Small changes for the 300G of 1961 included new front styling and Chrysler's own racing manual. Wheels were upgraded to 15-inch in order to make room for the larger brakes, and Chrysler sold about 1,600 of the $5,400 cars. For 1962, the fins were gone, and the cars were downsized to the shorter 122-inch wheelbase shared with Dodge, reducing the overall weight by about 300 pounds. But by this point, Chrysler was ready to cash in on all the image building with the new non-letter series, while the 300H continued on with the 413 with standard output of 380 horsepower and a limited number of 405 horsepower competition versions, there was now a cheaper regular 300 with a 383 wedge with only 305 horsepower. The new non-letter series cars were also available in 4-door sedan and 4-door hardtop, and starting prices were closer to $3,400. So it's no surprise that they sold only around 550 examples of the 300H compared to 24,000 of the non-letter series 300s. Skipping the letter I because it looked too much like a 1, the 300J for 1963 was restyled. Only 400 of the Js were made with 390 horsepower and only as a coupe, but power steering was now standard, and the suspension was softened from previous 300s, but the big car was still capable of an 8-second 0 to 60 and a quarter mile under 16 seconds. The 300K of 1964 had a standard 360 horsepower 413, and the Cross-Ram 390 horsepower version was an option. The convertible returned, but leather interior was no longer standard for the first time. Reduced features meant that the 300K was more than $1,200 cheaper than the 300J at just over $4,000, and sales climbed above 3,600, while the non-letter 300 sales climbed above 32,000. The new 300s for 1965 were bigger and slower and would be the last year for the letter series with the 300L. A 4-speed manual was optional, weight was up about 300 pounds to 4,200, and the 360 horsepower 413 was now the top engine for the 300 in both letter and non-letter series versions, as well as the top engine in the more luxury-oriented New Yorkers. Lesser 300s with the 383 were now up to 315 horsepower. Prices remained pretty much the same, and just over 2,800 of the L were made. The 413 was replaced by a 440 for 1966, producing 350 horsepower and 480 pound-feet of torque, while the 383 was up to 325 horsepower and 425 pound-feet of torque, and just under 50,000 300s would be sold that year. 1967 would see a number of minor changes, mostly to the styling, and the only 4-door that was available would be the hardtop. The 383 version was dropped, and the 440 was available in 350 horsepower and 375 TNT versions. Hidden headlights would be a distinguishing styling feature added for 1968 that would continue to the end of the original 300's run. New fuselage styling arrived in 1969, although engine choices remained unchanged. Weight was still around 4,000 pounds, and pricing started around $4,100, with sales reaching around $32,000. Advertising was more focused on the torsion quiet ride than it was performance. 1970 got a special Hearst edition called the 300 Hearst that some people more associate with the letter series. It included Hearst gold on white paint, or more specifically, satin tan on spinnaker white. It also got a special fiberglass hood with a fake hood scoop and a fiberglass trunk lid with an integrated rear wing, helping lower the weight. It did not, however, include a Hearst shifter or any performance upgrades. With a $1,500 premium over a normal 300 with the same 375 horsepower, 480 pound-foot of torque 440 TNT V8, it's no wonder only 500 of the just over 21,000 300s wore the Hearst badge. Still, it could push its 2 tons to 60 in 7 seconds and do the quarter mile in less than 16. 1971 would be the end of the original run of 300s. It would see only minor changes that included a decrease in power from the 440 at 335 and 370 horsepower gross. Prices started just above $4,600 and sales were just below $14,000. But the name would be revived in 1979 for a limited performance version of the Chrysler Cordoba for $8,000, or more than $1,600 over a base Cordoba. In addition to cosmetic changes such as a traditional 300 crosshair grille, fake fender vents, and special wheels, the 4-barrel 360 cubic inch 5.9 liter V8 would get an upgraded cam and dual exhaust. This was only good for 195 horsepower net and 280 pound-feet of torque in a car weighing almost 3,900 pounds, which doesn't seem like much, but it was the same as a base Corvette that year. It would be the first car to wear the 300 badge with less than 300 horsepower, even if it had been rated gross like the previous cars. But it would have been relatively close. And the concept would carry on to the second generation Cordobas of 1980, but the 300 designation would not, instead being replaced by the designation LS. Leap forward 20 years, and Chrysler is on its second comeback tour, and thinking they need a more European-friendly version of their big car, meaning less big. They would not only revive the 300 name, but slap a letter on it, directly where they left off, with the 300M, although the M appeared to be lowercase. In the US, this shorter 5-meter version of the Chrysler LH car was otherwise just another large front-wheel drive Chrysler sedan using a 3.5-liter V6 good for 253 horsepower, noticeably short of the 300 suggested in its name. But with a 0 to 60 of just over 7 seconds and a quarter mile of just over 15, it wasn't the slowest car to wear the 300 badge. Prices started near $30,000, and it managed to win Car of the Year for 1999. European spec versions had 5 fewer horses from the 3.5-liter, and they also got a smaller 200 horsepower 2.7-liter V6. Perhaps it was called the 300 to represent its average European sales, but in the US, sales would typically be in the range of 30 to 55,000 a year. Starting in 2002, there was a special edition that gained 5 horsepower, and the final drive ratio changed from 3.66 to 3.89, marginally improving acceleration. It also sat lower and had more aggressive trim. But big changes would come in 2005 under Daimler Chrysler. The new 300's LX platform used a number of components off the E and S-Class Benzes, including the suspension, differential, transmissions, and primary electronics, all bolted to a larger Chrysler-developed unibody. The V6 engines carried over, with a 2.7-liter rated at 190 horsepower and the 3.5-liter at 250, but they would be joined by Hemi V8s from the Dodge Rams. In the 300C, that meant a 5.7-liter with 340 horsepower. But if that wasn't enough, you could opt for an SRT8 with a 6.1-liter Hemi and 425 horsepower. The C was good for a 0 to 60 of about 5.7 seconds and a quarter mile of just above 14. The SRT would knock nearly a second off both those times. Base price was now under $24,000, and a Hemi could be had for under $34,000, with the SRT models starting at about $40,000. All-wheel drive would be optional, but not on the SRT, and some markets would see a wagon version, but in the US, the wagon would get a different front-end treatment and be sold as the Dodge Magnum. A 3-liter diesel was also offered in some markets. The car would gain instant acclaim and fame, and sales would reach close to 145,000. The cars would be updated for 2011. In the US, the base engine would increase to a 3.6-liter V6 with 292 horsepower, while some other markets would have to settle for a 230 horsepower 3-liter. The 5.7 Hemi V8 would be up to 362 horsepower, and the SRT was up to 6.4 liters and 470 horsepower. A more luxurious Executive Series was added, as well as the 300S with blacked-out trim and grille, but the wagon was long gone. Base price was now up to $28,000, and the V8 models were starting at about $40,000, and sales would drop into the $50,000 to $75,000 range. The executive version of the car would be sold in Europe with only minor changes as the Lancia Thema through 2014. 2015 would bring a minor facelift and updates, including a change to a rotary dial shifter, and it would also be the end of the SRT in U.S. markets. Sales would start to decline after 2017, with sales dropping below 50,000 and below 20,000 for 2020. But the 300 remains of value in the large car field, with prices starting just above $30,000 for a base model and just under $40,000 for a V8. But it is essentially a 15-year-old design by a brand that's struggling to remain relevant in the modern American market. And although in all likelihood it has at least another year without any significant changes, the future of both the 300 and Chrysler are in question. As always, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.